Scrooge's Christmas Carol, Releasing the Last Chain. Written and illustrated by C. Pippin Lowe. Stave 6, Entering the Afterlife. Standing next to Scrooge's now extinguished fireplace, Marley said, "I know I have already told you about the danger of transmogrify, but this will be your last opportunity to forego moving in that direction." He took a deep breath, then asked, "Do you want to continue?"
"Yes, I do have some fear, but, well, let us just be on our way."
Marley detached a vial stored between the chains of his heart. He handed his friend the container of liquid, then instructed, "You will need to drink this potion." Scrooge removed the cork and drank the elixir. Immediately, he began coughing.
"What is this?"
"Poison," said Marley, then quickly added, "Only the dead can enter transmogrify."
"Jacob, when you were talking about me being in danger, I had no idea you were going to be the dangerous one."
With that, Scrooge made every effort to vomit the contents of the fluid, but the potion worked with a speed that could not be stopped. As Scrooge collapsed into his chair, Marley tried to reassure him. "Trust me." Tapping his chest, he said, "I have the antidote, Ebenezer. You will not die." With Scrooge nearing death, Marley whisked his friend off to the Isle of Transmogrify. Slumped at the entrance, Scrooge's vitality dwindled to barely noticeable. In a panic, Jacob made every effort to pluck from between his heart chains the bottle containing the poison's antidote. Try as he did, fire twirlers kept the vial secured within its restraints. Only with perseverance did the vessel finally drop from the chain, then directly pass through Marley's palm. The bottle hit the collapsed Ebenezer on the back of the head. Marley grabbed at the vial before it could strike the ground, yet the container proved difficult to control. Each time Marley thought he had a grasp on the bottle, it would start to slip through his feather-like body.
"Why has this dead not begun entanglement?"
asked Teint. Marley made no effort to face Transmogrify's guards. Instead, he hurried himself with Scrooge.
"I'm having a bit of trouble here."
It had never occurred to Marley that Scrooge would not be able to help himself drink the antidote. As Scrooge began to gasp for air, Marley attempted to deliver the life-saving liquid to his friend's lips. Scrooge just clamped his mouth tighter, which intensified his struggle for breath. Desperate to keep Scrooge alive, Marley bit off the tip of every one of his left-handed fingers. With the finger bones extending beyond the skin, Marley cupped his 5 digits together so they would form a small platform. Balancing the vial on the flat surface of his combined finger bones, Marley hoped the bottle would not fall through his hand before he could get the medicine into Scrooge. With his teeth, he removed the cork from the antidote. As feared, the vial began to pass through Marley's fingers. Struggling, he finally was able to twist the protruding bones in such a way it slowed the bottle just enough so it did not complete its fall through his hand. Realizing his grasp on the bottle would be short-lived, Marley reached into Scrooge's chest and directly dropped the liquid into his stomach. Teint and Apurto's platform had lowered to within 5 feet of the Londoners when Scrooge began to stir.
"Why has this dead not begun entanglement?"
repeated Teint. Scrooge opened his eyes to the glare of a floodlight blinding his vision. Next to him stood Marley's faded form. Before them, a platform hung, suspended from what appeared to be nothing. On top of the stage stood 2 colorless forms. Teint, the angel whose beacon of light had the ability to penetrate the heart's emotions while dimming the eye's vision, stood before Marley and Scrooge in radiant command.
"Jacob Marley,
Why has this dead not begun entanglement? Demanded Teint. Marley again ignored the light being's question. Instead, he helped Scrooge to his feet. Next to Teint stood an animal roughly the size and shape of a dog, yet its markings were closer to that of a tiger. The creature's short brownish fur highlighted its black stripes. As the dog-like animal coiled around and through Teint's light, the markings on his hind end began to absorb the radiance. When the beast's stripes began to glow, Teint slapped his own chest, then commanded, "Apurto, here, now." With that, the animal raised himself onto his hind feet, steadied himself with his tail, then rubbed the top of his head against his companion's cheek. Dropping back to his feet, Apurto joined Teint in his concern for the two in front of them. "Jacob Marley, you have brought a living person. Why?" inquired Teint. "I need Ebenezer's help in freeing Noah Marley. I cannot allow this. You know he could be harmed. He cannot save your brother if he loses his own life." "I will protect him," assured Marley. "How?" "We will walk the road of phantoms and never ascend to the corridor. For added safety, we will not step from the road. I will offer myself up for instant transmogrification if Ebenezer is injured," said Marley. "Instant transmogrification is not something you can bargain with. At any time you can choose to complete your transmogrification, but you cannot manipulate its use. So, do you want to go through instant transmogrification now?" asked Teint. "No, no," Marley shouted. "I just want to agree to any punishment required if I fail to protect Ebenezer." "A punishment? There is no penalty great enough to cure any injury that may be inflicted upon a living one. Wanting punishment after a preventable injury will not be allowed. No, he must go back."
"My life is nearly over, anyway. I am not afraid of the end," said Scrooge. After a short pause, he added, "I want to help, Jacob. I am here at my own desire."
Both Teint and Apurto turned their attention to Scrooge. Teint's glare felt like a challenge to Scrooge as the gatekeeper voiced, "Prove to me you welcome non-existence."
"After my death, will I not be here in transmography?"
"No, Ebenezer Scrooge. If you die in transmography, you will never have existed."
Shocked, Scrooge asked, "What will happen to me?"
"Earth time will adjust to accommodate your deletion from time's record," explained Teint.
"Deletion?"
"All aspects of you will be expunged."
After a silence where only the sounds of transmography could be heard, Scrooge finally broke the conversational quiet. "I wish to help, Jacob."
Apurto, the caretaker of transmography, jumped off the platform. After approaching the would-be invader, Apurto sniffed every inch of Scrooge. In the end, the beast only yawned. The sight of sharp teeth spooked Scrooge. Never had he experienced a creature whose jaw was hinged behind the ear. The idea that Apurto could bite him in half caused Scrooge to recoil from the mouth. Teint again slapped his chest and commanded, "Apurto, here, now." After observing Scrooge's encounter with his pet, Teint said, "Your bravery has failed you. Your earthly fears will betray you in transmography." As Apurto returned to the platform, Teint continued, "Transmography has no great need for your help. You must Wait, the transmogrification of a condemned innocent is at stake," cried Marley. Teint stopped the motion that would have returned Scrooge to the living and asked, "Condemned innocent? Is there no chance of transmogrification without the help of this earthbound? Within a millennium, maybe?" Your statement is exaggerated. None carry on in transmography for that length of time. Why do you believe Noah Marley's condemned innocent spirit will not become a mogrified spirit? Asked Teint. He was punished for a crime he did not perpetrate. Plus, he committed suicide, answered Marley. Why do you think he committed suicide? He has never dwelled within the pool. The warden at Newgate said he committed suicide. Ah, yes, the warden. He now dwells within the fields of destructive compulsions for his laziness. The truth was known among the turnkeys that Noah was murdered. The shock of Noah's true death silenced Marley. Teint lifted his arm, and next to their raised platform, an image appeared. As he lowered his arm, the scene of Noah's last moments on earth began to be revealed. Within the screen of moving images, Marley and Scrooge watched as Noah walked to Newgate's visitor fence. While he waited for Flora to arrive, James Maxey could be seen giving the turnkey the remainder of his funds. As the guard pocketed the money, he then turned and walked indoors. Maxey approached Noah undetected. Once behind him, he thrust Noah's head into the metal picket fence. The force from the shove knocked Noah unconscious. While Noah lay next to the fence, Maxey raised his prey's arm and then dragged it the full length of its measure over one of the sharpest barbs. As Maxey murdered Noah, he whispered into his ear, "Little fish gets eaten by big fish." Stepping free of the spurting blood, the killer left Noah dangling by his wrist. Entering the prison, Maxey smiled, for he knew Noah would die before he did. "So, you think this event created a condemned innocent in Noah?" asked Teint. "Maybe even two," replied Marley. "That would only happen if Noah were responsible for multiple deaths. He is not even guilty of his own death. His wife, Flora, died a few weeks after him. Her death may be on Noah's spirit as well," said Marley. "In truth, the responsibility of both of their deaths is on you, Jacob Marley. It is Flora who dwells within the pool, not Noah. Your reality has been a lie." Marley lowered his eyes as Teint explained. Noah Marley did generate a condemned innocent spirit, but seems to be progressing as expected, for he recently passed from the pit of anger into the abyss. He will finish his transmogrification on his own. But Flora, she sleeps too long. Surprised by Flora's stagnation within transmography, Marley asked, "You mean she still sleeps in the pool?" "Yes, Flora sleeps even though she has been sprayed with Coss acceptance." Teint then added, "She still resists the awakening." "Is not Coss acceptance the guarantee for triggering entanglement?" "For most, but some cannot be stirred until other aspects of their death have been put right," said Teint. Marley assumed Flora's hibernation within the pool of broken spirits was his fault. The only thing he knew for sure was that Noah would never complete transmogrification without Flora. He then offered, "We will save Flora as well as Noah." "We will?" inquired Scrooge. "I thought Noah was your focus," said Teint. "I thought the same," agreed Scrooge. "Noah is my task of outreach," replied Marley. He then added, "Flora may be more worthy of our help than Noah." "All spirits are worthy of help. Even those who have cut ties to the infinite consciousness are helped by the mechanics of their mog," said Teint. "Teint, please, show me the answer you need," requested a timid Marley. "Clever, Jacob. I cannot solve this problem. The dangers are many. Possibly every minute will bring a trouble that could end Ebenezer."
if I cannot offer myself up for instant transmogrification upon failure, or avoid dangerous spirits by travelling the road only, or even camouflaging Scrooge with my own spirit when needed, then I do not think I can protect him." Camouflage, Tien muttered, as he cloaked the remainder of his thought in silence. "I've become skilled at—" and within the next moment, Marley changed his appearance into that of Scrooge's. Tien smiled as he looked upon the double images of Scrooge standing before him. The angel then spoke of a truth Marley had not taken into account. "It may be best if you take on the appearance of an entity that spirits fear, and not change into the one they wish to prey upon." Marley pondered this reality for a few moments before he too grinned. However, his frustration with the inability to find a solution for protecting Scrooge controlled his thoughts. As possible answers crossed paths in his mind, he was instantly forced to refocus his attention on the remaining chains binding his heart to his ordeal. Without warning, the chains began spewing sparks. "Jacob Marley, why have you removed a fire twirler from transmography?" demanded Teint. "Because they add a physicality to everything they are directed toward." He then waited for a response from the angel, but Teint remained quiet, so Marley continued, "I have already used one to help warm Noah while in jail. My 4 remaining fire twirlers will be used to defend Ebenezer from harm." He paused again, to hear only a silence that caused him concern. "I will only use them in the aid of Ebenezer." Still, Tien just glared at Marley. "I can return them to the fields of destructive compulsions when we pass it, if you would prefer." Tient finally said, "You have slowed the progress of a spirit by capturing their fire twirler." No. I only catch them when they have passed into the road of phantoms. They cannot survive that trespass. I am doing them a favor by using them as an energy source." "No, that is not a fire twirler's purpose. You are slowing down an individual's transmogrification when you trap their energy. Fire twirlers are not to be used by other spirits." Irritated by Marley's lack of responsibility, Teint asked, "You are aware that fire twirlers are what compulsive spirits create so they can release their destructive habits?" "To some extent," replied Marley. "Well, let me broaden your knowledge," Tien said with a hint of sarcasm. "When a fire twirler is trapped, the spirit who created it goes into standby mode until it is either returned or consumed. Jacob, you have slowed the progress of spirits." "But all spirits capture fire twirlers." "Do not say all when it is but a few who manipulate fire twirlers." "These fire twirlers are the only way I can assure Ebenezer's safety," Marley then added. "With fire twirlers, I will be able to ward off any attack." Teint considered all aspects of Marley's scheme before he said, "I will allow you to enter with Ebenezer, but only if you stay on the road, away from other spirits, and save the fire twirlers to be used when Ebenezer, not yourself, is in a life-threatening situation." "Ebenezer will be my only concern," Marley then whispered to Scrooge. "Let's go before he changes his mind." As they stepped behind Tien's platform, a curtain of illumination lit up the sky being played out in transmography. Changing from black to cobalt blue, the sky above Marley and Scrooge instantly made visible hundreds of spirits traveling to and from transmography. Marley pointed to the group, then said, "The task of outreach keeps us all busy." As spirits passed over them, Scrooge asked, "Why are they above us?" "The road is too dangerous for spirits.
especially near the crater of severed spirits. Most phantoms travel the corridor, but you and I, Ebenezer, must keep to the road. That is our agreement with Teint." As they entered the deeply blue area, Apurto growled at them. Upon their first step inside Transmogrify, the sky lightened, but only a bit. Before them could be heard the sounds of spirits at work. The 5 upper Mog's activities could be heard, but from the entrance, not seen. As Marley took his first step inside of Transmogrify, the second chain attached to his heart disappeared, and with it dropped a fire twirler. As it spun free of its abductor, Marley said, "You better stay safe, Ebenezer. I only have 3 of those remaining." Waving for Scrooge to follow, Marley added, "Maybe you will be safe without a 4th. Scrooge took his second step into Transmogrify. The gravity of the afterlife pressed down on him.
"Jacob, I can't breathe."
"I was afraid."
"I'm burning up. What is this place?"
"I was not expecting—"
"Do something,"
Scrooge demanded. As Scrooge pulled himself into a fetal position, Marley crouched next to his backside. Wrapping himself around his gasping friend, he hugged him so deeply that his ghostliness combined with Scrooge's flesh. As the 2 beings became indistinguishable, Scrooge began to take shallow breaths, sweat filling every pore of his structure. Rising to his knees, Scrooge said,
"If I don't cool, I will ignite."
Marley removed one of the fire twirlers from between his heart's chain. The little energy blaze spun with such a speed that flames sprayed off in every direction. With the vision of a glacier in his mind, Marley held the fire twirler next to his skeleton. With this mental image in control of the fire twirler, Marley's structure turned to ice. The chill decreased his mobility. Though stiff, Marley flung himself over Scrooge. Slowly, Scrooge revived from the dual attack of Transmogrify's gravity and heat. "We will have to stay within a short distance of each other, or gravity will again crush you. The heat you will learn to manage."
"Why is there such an intense pressure here?"
asked Scrooge. "After death, the ability to physically feel becomes almost absent. However, the need to perceive our senses is required for our work toward acceptance. Without an intensified gravity, no spirit would be able to complete transmogrification."
"And the heat, why is it so hot?"
"I did not expect that. Heat just does not affect most spirits, so I did not know to make plans for it. Why I didn't think of it, I don't know, because it makes sense that transmography would be hot. Every area has its own energy source, which of course creates heat. Once we crest the hill over there, the sparks will become obvious." Marley pointed to the top of the hill before them. Scrooge regained his footing just in time to greet the chaos of a floating head biting his neck.
"What bedlam is this?"
exclaimed Scrooge as he grabbed the injured area. But before any explanation could be offered, another head attacked Scrooge. With urgency, Marley raced past Scrooge while shouting, "Fast! Follow me, Ebenezer!" Without thinking, Marley shot so far ahead that Scrooge found himself released from their shared gravity field. As Scrooge dropped to his knees, he clutched his chest. Wheezing, he whispered the word, "Stop!" Marley paid no attention to his friend's utterance. Instead, he focused on knocking away the approaching heads.
"Help me!"
cried Scrooge as he surrendered to the forces attacking him. Marley turned to view his friend lying upon the road, motionless. Racing back to him, Scrooge began to arrive as soon as Marley re-entered their shared gravity field. Attached to Scrooge's neck were the teeth from a spirit's head. The head itself did not appear to be available for reassembly, So, Marley carefully grabbed both sides of the teeth, then pulled them apart just enough to effect Scrooge's release. Helping Scrooge to his feet, he ordered, "Follow me." Marley began running toward the center of Transmogrify. "Run, Ebenezer, and this time keep up with me."
"Why are we running towards the heads?"
yelled Scrooge. "It's the only way to escape." The only escape Scrooge figured they were involved in was the abandonment of their good senses. Frantic, the two raced toward the hilltop. With each step, the dismembered heads continued to assault Scrooge's flesh. As they neared the crest of the hill, the road gained several feet of distance. When 20 feet became 30, Scrooge replaced his fear with frustration. Grabbing the head currently in attack, he threw it to the ground with such a force it bounced not once but repeatedly. The unfortunate cranium reached new heights with each rebound. Scrooge raced past the deflected skull in pursuit of Marley's gravity. At the top of the hill, Marley abruptly stopped. Scrooge ran right through him as several of the heads flew over the top of the hill. Realizing he would soon be out of Marley's gravity, Scrooge turned toward his friend, leaned over, and said,
"I have never moved so fast in my entire life."
Heaving air in and out of his lungs, he asked,
"Why have we stopped?"
"Is it not obvious?" Scrooge pondered the question, then replied,
"Not to me."
"The heads, look," he said, pointing upward. "They no longer care about you, Ebenezer." Scrooge watched as a couple of heads flew mere feet above his eyes. Gaining his breath, he pointed over Marley's shoulder, then asked,
"What is Apurto doing?"
Marley turned to face the front gate. Together, the two friends watched as Apurto used his tail to power his ability for bouncing twice his height. At his apex, Apurto snatched one of the spirit's heads, then gently placed it into his marsupial pouch. As Apurto filled his pouch with dismembered skulls, Marley explained, "Those fierce biters were never after you, Ebenezer.
You could have fooled me."
"They only had the desire to escape Transmogrify. Apurto is capturing them because it's his job."
"I don't understand. How do such skulls even exist?" asked Scrooge.
"They are what is produced whenever there is a Coss acceptance release."
"Why?"
"None within the crater are allowed any help from either the infinite consciousness or other spirits," said Marley.
"I still do not understand why the infinite consciousness abandons those in the crater."
"Ebenezer, it is just the opposite. Those within the crater abandoned the infinite consciousness." Apurto grabbed another head as Scrooge asked,
"So, what Apurto is doing helps?"
"Yes, Apurto is trying to save those spirits. Whenever a group of Coss achieves acceptance, the force of their release pulls apart the spirits closest to them. Apurto is just returning the parts so the spirits can be made whole again." Scrooge is shocked by this reality.
"The salvation of some creates the destruction of others."
"It is the mechanics of the crater."
"It seems brutal."
"The difficulty of existing without the infinite consciousness's influence is not cruel. It is excruciating." Scrooge winced at the thought as Marley pointed toward the entrance, then said, "Soon, Apurto is going to return the heads to the crater. Most of them will reassemble with their other limbs."
"Most of them?"
"Some will be lost when their head or backbone is not recovered. Otherwise, even limbless Coss will eventually achieve transmogrification."
"Look!"
Scrooge yelled as he pointed to Apurto.
"He just swallowed a head."
"His pouch is out of space," explained Marley.
"So?"
"Well, he can't let them escape transmography, can he?"
"So, He eats them.
That's better than a bunch of roaming heads traveling the universe.
Not to the individual heads.
Ebenezer, each spirit creates their own agony. They had a choice in life, yet all within the crater willingly appropriated authorities that only belong to the infinite consciousness. As Apurto lowered himself to the ground, his pouch settled upon the road's surface. Dragging his belly, the custodian of transmography began moving toward them. The mass of a dozen heads within his pouch slowed his travel. As he passed them in pursuit of returning the skulls, Scrooge and Marley finally surmounted the hill overlooking transmography. Marley waited for Scrooge's response. The roar of transmography could be heard from the entrance, but the glare, that had been undetectable. As they crested the hill, a blast of bluish light confronted them. Scrooge stopped in mid-stride as his mouth dropped open. Directly before them stood hundreds of trees surrounding the 3 pits of the Plains of Violence. Extending out from the entrance of each pit were countless one-room boxes. Each contained a spirit, sometimes 2, depending on the progress of the spirit being housed within the contemplation chamber. Surrounding the 3 pits was the forest of burning trees. Though forest fires are mostly unheard of in London, Scrooge instantly recognized this eruption of flames was outside of his known reality. He watched as every tree burned only from inside the center of their trunk, and all of the leaves, branches, and bark remained pristine. Scrooge pointed to the plains. He doubted his vision, yet only expressed his bewilderment with one word: "Why?" Sensing his confusion, Marley offered, "The forest of burning trees powers the pits."
The flames seem to be consuming no wood.
The infinite consciousness provides the fuel. The forest is just the method of power transfer, but not the actual energy itself.
Why?
Asked the confused Scrooge. My best guess, and it is only a guess, is that those that occupy a chamber need all of their personal energy to complete their transmogrification.
Why?
There are some bad characters in there, Ebenezer, Marley said, then continued. Violent acts do not resolve themselves through time, they fester. I have a feeling the task of outreach was created just to help those in the plains. The chambers look calm and organized, but one thing I know from personal experience is that the chambers are hard work.
If the infinite consciousness powers the plains, who powers that area?
Scrooge asked, pointing to the cycle of greed. Most mogs are set up so the spirits themselves generate the power needed for the area.
Why does there need to be any kind of energy force at all? Wondered Scrooge.
I can only think of 2 reasons. First, it seems there is a lot of energy spent on keeping the gravity we need within transmography.
This is so spirits can experience themselves as physical beings again.
Yes, just enough to perceive their own life's actions.
And the second reason? Asked Scrooge.
Each spirit is provided with the conditions they will need in order to form their tasks of outreach, so they can eventually become a mogrified spirit. Transformation into acceptance takes a massive amount of energy.
Most mogs generate their own energy. How do they do that?
Each has its own way. Even in the pool of broken spirits, those that sleep still generate the area's power through the tears they shed. However, within the plains of violence and in the abyss, the infinite consciousness provides all the energy.
Why doesn't the infinite consciousness provide all the energy to everything? Asked Scrooge.
It can't. Marley replied, as he began walking toward the plains of violence. Quickening his pace, Scrooge asked,
I thought the infinite consciousness could do anything.
Not when the tie has been cut.
I do not understand.
Ebenezer, what do you do when a person betrays you? Scrooge had no immediate answer, so Marley continued. It is difficult for an individual to cut their connection to the infinite consciousness. Nonetheless, those who maim others while deceiving themselves into thinking they have the infinite consciousness's power behind their act end up condemning their own spirit to the crater. Again he paused, then finished his thought with, those in the crater suffer the most within transmography.
The crater, where the biting heads are from.
The heads would never exist if the infinite consciousness could directly help those with the spirit breakage, answered Marley.
Are those in the crater the only ones that cut their own infinite consciousness connection?
You mean a spirit breakage?
Yes, that seems to be what you were calling it, replied Scrooge.
Those who take their own life also cut their tie to the infinite consciousness. I guess it is a slap in the face to reject the infinite consciousness's most precious gift, life.
But they don't suffer as much as those in the crater, asked Scrooge.
They are asleep and only connect up with their suffering once they awaken.
Definitely sounds like something I am going to have to see to believe.
That is the way of transmography, Ebenezer. As Scrooge gained the focus of the entire area, he realized there were environments of commotion as far as he could see. To the left were the plains of violence with their flaming trees, but across the road, the grinding sound and sparks of metal upon stone dominated the scene. The bone-crushing noise created a ferocious tension as spirits endlessly plodded around an iron disc. As the metal scraped over the flint, sparks flamed in every direction. Yet, no matter the commotion, the toiling spirits focused only on the object at the center of their platform, the golden crown of greed. Marley pointed to the turning wheel, then said, That is where my spirit of greed transformed.
Will I have to shuffle around that circle? Asked Scrooge.
Not unless you change your ways again, Marley then said to Scrooge. We are not concerned with the greedy. We need to make sure Noah has been transported to the abyss of final transmography. Follow me. Marley quickened his pace to the pit of anger, where Noah's spirit had originally been sent. Though Jacob Marley had died long after his brother, his transformation from the plains pit of dishonesty had occurred before Noah could resolve the issues of having been both falsely accused of theft and then viciously murdered. Noah's condemned innocent spirit struggled with the pain and anger caused by both actions. I hope Teint was correct when he said Noah was in the abyss.
I assumed Teint would know, said Scrooge.
Of course, you are correct, but we are going by the pit, so I just want to make sure.
Trust, but verify.
That pins the need. With the overpowering roar of grinding at the cycle, the contrast of a deafening silence coming from the plains of violence created a foreboding despair within Scrooge. Even the muted sounds from the forest of burning trees added to the sensation of hardship. Of the three pits, Noah's was first on the road. The two watched as the Contemplation chamber's door closest to the pit of anger opened. Out stepped the spirit. The spirit's next stride was made directly into the pit, from which it then instantly disappeared from view.
Where has the spirit gone? Asked Scrooge.
It is already in the abyss. Seeing Ebenezer's confusion, Marley then added, The pit is little more than the gateway. The work occurs in the Contemplation chambers, Marley said, pointing to the now empty chamber. "Watch." They observed the contemplation chamber as it vanished. The box just disappeared. The next chamber in line shifted to the Pit of Anger's entrance. Without a wasted moment, the spirit from that chamber entered the pit, then evaporated from view as it arrived in the abyss. The process of spirits leaving their isolation chamber only to be transported to an area ominously called the abyss repeated continuously. While Marley and Scrooge watched the flow of spirits pass through the mog, one chamber seemed to get stuck when no spirit exited the door. All action halted in the Pit of Anger until the entire chamber began to lift upward, then floated away.
"Where is it going?"
asked Scrooge. The spirit within that chamber did not complete its task of outreach before it arrived to the pit.
"So, where is it going?"
asked Scrooge again. "To the back of the line."
"That does not seem fair, that it has to start all over."
"The contemplation chamber's purpose cannot be denied. Without a task, no spirit within transmography is ever allowed into the abyss, except—"
"Jacob, do not go silent now."
"This is almost too much information for you, but the Coss go directly to acceptance. They do not spend any time in the abyss."
"Yes, my friend, that means nothing to me," replied Scrooge.
"My words could never explain such a visual as the crater to you, Ebenezer." At this point, Marley realized Noah was absent from the plains. He added, "Teint was right. Time to trek toward the abyss."
"How long will that take?"
"Maybe months." Shocked, Scrooge tried to form a question, but none presented itself. So he just stared at Marley with hopes he would pick up on his confusion. "Don't worry, Ebenezer. It depends on Transmography's population as to the length of time it will take us to travel the road."
"Population?"
"Sure. Transmography has been shrinking ever since the Crusades ended."
"Shrinking?"
"Most mogs have a constant flow of spirits, maybe just a little growth as the Earth's population expands."
"Then why is there ever any change in size within Transmography?"
"The crater and the pit of physical harm have an unnatural influence on Transmography's dimensions."
"Jacob, that does not explain a thing."
"Answer me this, Ebenezer. Does war produce more dead in a quicker period of time than would be created without it?"
"Logic would dictate so."
"In my mind, Ebenezer, there are only two reasons for war. One, to expand the territory, and two is to conform the mindset."
"So, the crater is where warriors go."
"Warriors more often spend their afterlife in a chamber, but it depends on their motives. The crater is where humans are sent to kill others while thinking the infinite consciousness wants them to do that. That poor crater, it just expands and contracts as humans harm through spiritual ignorance. Every holy war brings a size change to Transmography," explained Marley.
"Holy wars. There has not been one of them in a long while."
"But we did just get over the witch trials. A number of officials and faggot carriers were added to the Creator during that period of time."
"So, it's not just holy wars."
"Do you think one person would have been burned if not for the church?" Marley asked, but did not wait for an answer. "No, Ebenezer. The only reason a spirit spends their time in the crater of severed spirits is because they harmed others while thinking they were doing the infinite consciousness's work." Marley paused to wait for a response, but when none came forth, he continued, "And that era of conflicting passions will end up destroying a portion of them." Marley took in a deep breath, then ended with, "So, who ultimately is more harmed in the end, the victim or the perpetrator?" Scrooge realized Marley was being rhetorical and wanted no response, so he just continued to follow his friend. As the two passed the pit of physical harm, Marley glimpsed a view of James Maxey. The killer sat in the 5th chamber from the entrance. Within his contemplation chamber, Maxey prepared for the pit in silence. His expression had lost the harsh features of his earthly face, yet Marley recognized the criminal's characteristics. Reaching into his chest, Marley grabbed a fire twirler, brought it forward, and announced, "I'm going to send him to the back of the line."
"Wait, Jacob. We only have 2 left, and you promised Teint.
Maxley is not going to achieve transmogrification before Noah.
But Noah is already ahead of Maxey. Is he not already in the abyss?" asked Scrooge.
"Yes."
"So leave it be, Jacob. Maxey is not going to achieve transmogrification first."
"And I was so looking forward to adding 30 years to his miserable wait," Marley said, placing the fire twirler back between his chains.
"Do you think Teint would have stopped you?"
"No. It is more likely I would have been sent back to the pit of anger." He paused, then added, "Thank you for speaking with reason, Ebenezer." Scrooge smiled, then, in an effort to comfort Marley, passed his hand through the spirit's shoulder. As the two passed the cycle of greed, Scrooge was glad he would not have to spend any time walking the circle. He wondered which mogs he would be in once his entanglement was achieved. That is, if he can escape Transmogrify's annihilation of living visitors. While in the process of passing the cycle, Scrooge watched as one of the spirits turned its head from the golden crown at the center, then instantly disappeared.
"Did you see that?"
"What?" asked Marley. Excited, Scrooge pointed to the circle as he said,
"A person just perished from the cycle."
"They aren't people anymore, nor are they gone. They just proceeded to the abyss of final transmography. Don't worry, Ebenezer, they are fine." While they passed the silent pits on their left, and the cycle was grinding away to their right, Scrooge felt the splash of water on his clothing. Just beyond the plains of violence stood a narrow but lengthy area of torrential rain. Approaching the source of the moisture, Marley instructed Scrooge, "Stay away from the rains of darkness."
"Why?"
"No one knows what the rains are for, but that water will incinerate you."
"Incinerate? How can rain burn?"
"I don't know, Ebenezer. All I know is that spirits are in terror of it. The rumor is that the rains are used to keep fire twirlers out of the plains of violence." Scrooge wiped away the liquid that had fallen onto his clothing, then said,
"It just seems like water to me."
"Don't touch it anymore."
"Jacob, I have never seen you so animated."
"All I know is that stuff destroys. Leave it alone." They passed the rains of darkness on the left without harm. The two continued to walk as they watched new spirits arrive at the cycle of greed. While a half-dozen arrivals settled into their new reality, sparks, like a dragon's roar, flared across the road. Shocked by the offense, Scrooge instinctively jumped from the flames. His attempt to avoid the burn only resulted in him slipping off the road. Instantly engulfed in the greed's flares, Scrooge cried out, "Jacob!" But before he could express his need, he dropped. Marley grabbed Scrooge's fiery clothes. The collapsed human remained still as the sparks entered Marley rather than Scrooge, and the flow of fire surrounded the two. As Marley absorbed the flames into himself, Scrooge began to cool. With a force nearly human, Marley pulled Scrooge back onto the road where they both collapsed. Scrooge moaned as he lay nearly paralyzed from the scorching heat. Recovery from the thrashing of sparks remained elusive for the two. Marley, even though less affected by the flames, rolled around in his attempt to recover. Huffing and puffing, Scrooge lay flat on his back. Lying motionless, he watched the spirits above him move along the corridor of phantoms. The flow through the corridor was constant, as spirits moved to and from Transmogrify, each on its own mission. As Scrooge observed those travelling above him, it suddenly occurred to him that none were wrapped in chains. Scrooge pondered this reality, so as he pointed upward, he asked,
"Why are none of those spirits encased in the chains of their actions?"
Chains tether spirits to Transmogrify when out of the area. They are never needed within the Mogs.
"Oh, look at that spirit,"
Scrooge said, pointing to a spirit without legs. Before Marley could warn Scrooge against calling attention to himself, the legless spirit turned its focus to the two lying upon the road. "Now you have done it," said Marley. Within the next instant, the spirit positioned itself directly above Scrooge. Scrambling to his feet, the spirit demanded from him, "Who are you, and why do you live?" Scrooge quickly gave his name, but had no answer to the second question. Marley tried to be the go-between for Scrooge, but the legless spirit would have nothing to do with Marley. The spectre remained fixated on Scrooge. "Cannot a spirit have a place of its own without your kind invading?"
"I wish you no harm. I am here at the request of my friend Jacob."
Scrooge pointed to Marley and then added,
"Teint has approved of my entry."
"Teint would never make such an approval," insisted the spirit.
"True, but Ebenezer is here to help save my brother, Noah, who is a condemned innocent," Marley explained.
The handicapped spirit quieted as his stare focused on Scrooge. His anger turned to concern as he confessed, "I'm a condemned innocent too. Difficult." His thoughts of human trespass dropped away as he remembered the crisis in which his condemned innocent spirit was formed. A tear developed as he thought about the pain of having both of his legs cut off. The revisited terror of being left to die in a pool of his blood softened the spirit's demeanor toward Scrooge. "You are here to help a condemned innocent?"
"Yes," replied Marley.
"Then I approve. You can continue." With that, the spirit drifted back to the corridor.
"That was odd," commented Scrooge.
"You are fortunate you weren't forced from Transmogrify. Any spirit can require that of you, so don't look up again," commanded Marley.
"Why did that spirit have body parts missing?"
"Spirits are allowed to use the physical form they think they will need in order to become a mogrified spirit."
"But why would any choose to go without legs?"
asked Scrooge. "Ebenezer, sometimes you ask impossible questions."
"Well?"
"You really think I know the answer to that question? The reason is personal for that spirit, so of course I have no knowledge of their rationale. Your question cannot be answered, at least not by me." Marley paused, then instructed, "Now, if you have recovered from the sparks, let us continue." Less than a dozen steps past the reins of darkness, Marley pointed to a pathway that was comprised entirely of spirits' limbs. "Let's cross the dam." Scrooge stared at the tangled pathway, observing the interactions between the detached legs and arms of spirits. As the hand of one spirit grasped the leg of another, together with thousands of others doing the same, they formed a pathway of moving but stable limbs.
"My better judgment."
"No reason to bring that in. Just follow me, Ebenezer."
"But the road, Teint said."
"Every chance I get, I bypass the crater of severed spirits. We all do. So, just follow me."
"But I have been hearing so much about the crater. I don't want to bypass it."
"Trust me, you do."
"Such a disappointment."
We are not on holiday here. Come on, Ebenezer, before more Coss acceptance is released along with a flurry of new heads. Scrooge stood at the entrance of the dam of disconnected parts, fixated on the thousands of clasping hands. The clutching and release of so many fists created a visual dance of fingers. As appendages constantly shifted, Marley took a step onto the dam. Tentacles of confused claws grabbed for his skin, yet he continued unharmed. See, they are powerless, Marley assured Scrooge. Comforted by his friend's confidence, Scrooge followed Marley onto the dam. The first step was oddly solid for Scrooge. With the second step, a hand reached up and grabbed for the flesh of his leg. Scrooge felt a tingling sensation next to his bones, but the skeleton passed through him. Each step brought new hands grasping, then passing through Scrooge. He was nearly halfway across the dam when two hands simultaneously grabbed him from each side of his leg. The two claws met in the middle of Scrooge's leg, joining fingers around his tibia and trapping him to the location.
Jacob! Jacob! They have me!
Surprised, Marley grabbed one of the hands. The two skeletons had encircled Scrooge with such a captivating hold the spirit's bones did not need to defend against Marley's prying pressure, for they had formed into one solid bone around Scrooge's ankle. As the two toiled to achieve Scrooge's freedom, another pair of hands reached into his other leg, trapping it likewise to the dam. Flailing like a tree in the wind, Scrooge screamed in terror. As Marley twisted, tilted, and made every effort to disengage the spirit's appendages, Scrooge began to be pulled downward. Just as his knees disappeared into the mesh of bones, Apurto appeared. Without warning, the beast shredded the hand pulling the hardest on Scrooge. Freeing the tension of its descending pull caused the remaining limbs to loosen their grip on him. As Apurto's jaws clamped tight upon each offending hand, the spirit's hold upon Scrooge was reduced to naught. After freeing the human, Apurto grabbed the seat of Scrooge's pants, then pulled him back to the road. Once safe, both Scrooge and Marley faced the beast and said, "Thank you." Apurto just growled.
I don't think he likes you,
said Scrooge. I doubt that he likes either of us, replied Marley. As the caretaker raced toward the crater of severed spirits to deposit the collected limbs, Marley and Scrooge slowly followed. They passed acres of spirit appendages within the dam of disconnected parts. Most were constantly shifting in an effort to grab onto anything. Being 5 times wider than long, the dam provided hours of gawking for the pair as they continued to walk toward the crater. Uncertain of what the road would bring next, Scrooge purposely decided to trail behind Marley. Sensing his uneasiness, Marley tried to reassure his friend. "I will protect you, Ebenezer," he then added. "Just remember, those on the inside cannot harm any that travel on the road."
On the inside? Inside of what? Jacob, I would be buried among fingers and toes right now if it were not for Apurto rescuing me. Why did you put me in that danger?
Marley just shrugged his shoulders and said, "I will do better by you, Ebenezer." He waited for a reaction, but none was given, so Marley changed the subject. "Soon you will see the apex of the crater."
Jacob, with a nickname like the Crater, why would there be an apex to such a place?
"Ebenezer, this is not a conversation of importance."
"Why not?"
"Because it will reveal itself soon. Just be patient," assured Marley.
So, is acceptance important enough to talk about?
Acceptance is what this place is all about. So, what is on your mind? Marley paused, then waited for a response.
On Earth, love has no physical properties. But you say acceptance is physical, and acceptance is love, right?
Acceptance combines both the cleansed human experience and love energy.
Neither of those things have a bit of material substance to them. So, my question stands. How can acceptance possess any physical properties? Asked Scrooge.
As you already know, Transmogrify has a gravity that compresses everything. That even applies to the love energy of acceptance.
So, outside of Transmogrify,
it spreads out, so its physical properties are no longer detectable. However, all words and concepts have energy contained within them, said Marley.
Energy cannot be seen or touched. It is not physical,
insisted Scrooge. And yet it does physical work. So, Ebenezer, how can something that is not physical perform physically? Scrooge contemplated in silence as they continued toward the mounting white glow on the horizon. Suddenly, he asked,
Jacob, is there any place where acceptance actually becomes a solid substance?
Ebenezer, I don't even have the ability to hear or understand the infinite consciousness's name. How could I ever know that? He quickly thought about the idea, then added, It is an interesting notion. Imagine sitting on a rock of love. I assume even the hardest of individuals would soften at such contact.
Do you think it would solve the world's problems?
You mean, instead of England's bloody code, it would just become the blood-stained code?
Ebenezer laughed at the thought. It does seem our culture is rooted in violence.
Forced conformity without empathy is society's principal injury toward the individual.
So, a brick of love might not change a thing, asked Scrooge.
Sure, it would, for the people in contact with it. But for the mob who moves only along the path controlled by the social order, then, unfortunately, change only happens when forceful people press for adjustments. Marley paused, then continued. Change is not always beneficial, Ebenezer. Depending on the individual doing the pressuring, change can make things worse within society. Scrooge pointed toward the skyline, then exclaimed,
The white glow is turning orange.
Damn, Marley yelled, jumping on top of Scrooge. As the two collapsed upon the road, a swoosh of motion passed over Marley. While a surge of warm air rushed beyond them, the clattering of spirit bones crashing together could be heard overhead. As the limbs fell into the dam of disconnected parts, skulls forced their way toward the entrance. All the while, Marley protected Scrooge from the swarm of biting heads. Once the motion of the wind could no longer be felt, Marley allowed Scrooge to stand. Before he was completely vertical, Scrooge lifted his nose upward, took in a flood of air, then asked,
Is that roses I smell?
Marley looked at Scrooge like he was a lunatic, then answered, No, Coss acceptance always has the faint odor of fresh baking bread.
That's not food I smell. That's a flower, insisted Scrooge.
I tell you, you are daft. Coss acceptance has the best smell I have experienced.
Yes, roses.
The two looked at each other, snorted in disagreement, then dropped the subject.
I think I can now see more than just the top of the crater,
said Scrooge, pointing to the apex's motion of iridescent fluid and fluttering wings. Marley just quickened his pace. After a couple of hours, without any warning, the crater of severed spirits just appeared to Scrooge. Like a fog lifting, the crater's motion became visible. Marley had been watching the crater's commotion since the dam. However, Scrooge, lacking any known references, had to wait until his mind caught up with the visuals before his understanding became possible. Scrooge felt the heat of the crater long before he could see the furore of spirit struggling within it. He came to a standstill as the bubble that contained the crater exaggerated every spirit's climb up the quartz and lodestone walls. The impenetrable texture of the crater's containment wall appeared similar to water, in that it was in constant motion, yet had a slight magnification, and though dynamic in action, remained transparent. As Scrooge's vision focused upon the shimmering membrane containing the crater, a rising Coss vomited barbell all over the side of the covering sheath. Scrooge jumped back as the fluid dripped into the crater. Nothing but Coss acceptance can penetrate the crater's wall. Marley paused, pointed to a glob of barbell clinging to the barrier, then added, "You should just be happy you do not have to smell that stuff." "I thought it smelled like roses," commented Scrooge. "You are confusing barbell with Coss acceptance." Marley pointed to the collection of Coss gathered near the top of the enclosure, then said, "Barbell, released from more mature Coss at the top, has a pleasant odor. Yet that young Coss just christened us with something closer to dung than perfume." Confused, Scrooge asked, "Why do they spew anything?" "Ebenezer, can you see to the bottom of the crater?" Scrooge squinted as he peered into the depths of the crater. The various motions of activity slowed his perception of the chasm. As his vision moved past the thousands of spirits climbing the walls beneath him, he fixated on the deepest point, at the center of the crater. Newly arriving spirits, collapsing into the flames, dominated his view. "It's an inferno down there." "Without the smelly barbell, the entire crater would be a mass of flames," explained Marley. He then added, "In general, fire does not affect a spirit. But down there," he said, pointing to the blaze, "it might hurt." "Why do you think that?" asked Scrooge. Marley, lost in thought, only said, "We need to move past this place quickly. Stop staring and keep walking." Scrooge slowed down. With each step, his infatuation with new impressions stalled his legs. Among the flames at the crater's trench struggled spirits attempting to move past each other, each climbing over the top of others. The lake of flames circling the bottom of the crater only lessened its fire and siphoning motion upon the release of barbell. For, in that instant, the swirling blaze would be temporarily smothered, only briefly, though, for as the spirits continued their climb over the quartz and lodestone covering the crater, sparks again set fire to the pool of degrading barbell. Once a newly arrived spirit had moved beyond the lake of flames and was climbing the side of the crater, their experience became one of toiling toward the ledge where transformation into a Coss occurred. While the journey up the crater's sides held both terrors and awakenings for each spirit, the goal was to acknowledge, then transform their idea that they were themselves the infinite consciousness into a desire to be in alliance with the infinite consciousness's actual plan of provenance. Being bombarded with the chaotic movement of spirits within the crater caused Scrooge to lose focus. The confusion of unfamiliar activities dazed him into a standstill. Marley, concentrating elsewhere, failed to realize Scrooge had stopped walking. Upon hearing his friend's scream, he twisted around, only to find Scrooge once again crumpled on the road. Returning to him, he deliberately explained, "Ebenezer, you have to keep close to me." Pushing himself to his knees, Scrooge replied, "Then don't move so fast." "We have a lot of territory to travel, Ebenezer. If you think the crater is huge, and it is," Marley said, swinging his arm over the vastness of the place, "then the fields of destructive compulsions is going to shock you." He grinned, then slyly added, "That Mog could be bigger than the whole of Earth." "No,
"It is not Jacob,"
Scrooge said, half smiling. Marley clasped his fingers around Scrooge's upper arms, and then, with a quick jerk, helped him to his feet.
"What is all of this I'm seeing?"
asked Scrooge, as he performed the same arm swing over the crater that Marley had just completed. Marley grasped the truth that Scrooge had been captivated. Watching him watch the chaos of the crater made him realize he would not be able to move his friend along the road until he allowed Ebenezer a good old-fashioned gawking at the crater. Scrooge observed in silence as Marley watched the emotions on his friend's face change with each new set of actions playing out. Before the friends struggled a spirit not more than a dozen feet from them. Scrooge became mesmerized by the angst within the spirit, trying to gain a position atop the ledge. The spirit toiled, as did thousands of others trying to accomplish the task of mounting the ridge where their transformation into a Coss would occur. Finally, standing with its back to the riveted pair of watchers, the spirit slowly raised their arms perpendicular to their body. Motion stopped as the spectre's arms developed into multiple wings, each covered with black feathers. Scrooge's mouth, already being in a gaping state, dropped wide open when each wing's attachment to the body blinked open. From each of the eyes flowed a cascade of light. The metamorphosis from spirit to Coss reached completion when a massive amount of barbell flew out from the beak of the bird-like creature now standing in front of them. The transforming individual continued to vomit the greasy barbell. With each ejection, the Coss rose higher into the crater's center. Eventually, a fluttering of wings began to carry the creature to the amassed collection of Coss gathered at the crown of the enclosed crater.
"Look, Jacob!"
Scrooge shouted, while pointing at a malformed Coss. The creature spun in circles as it battled to create an upward lift. The beast's rotating contortions caused Scrooge to close his eyes in an effort to prevent a queasiness from overpowering his stomach. "You should cheer for that Coss."
"Why?"
"They have already survived one Coss release, and by the looks of them, not all of their limbs returned to the crater."
"Do you think that is one of the heads that bit me?"
"No. Skulls are returned to the Lake of Flames. Their climb to the ledge starts anew, but only after enough of their bones have reconnected. The heads that attacked you are still joining up with body parts."
"That just isn't fair,"
complained Scrooge. "Ebenezer, you know the crater is not about fairness. It was created so a spirit could evolve without any outside help."
"It seems to be an excessive burden that for some who are nearly finished with the transmogrification process, they end up ripped apart by other escaping Coss."
Marley swung his arm over the vastness of the Creator, then said, "Nothing in there was created with malicious intentions." Scrooge moaned as he pointed to the still floundering creature, then asked,
"Is that Coss going to be all right?"
"It will probably end up being the happiest Coss acceptance to come from that group," Marley said, pointing to the group of connected Coss at the apex. They watched as hundreds of black-winged creatures pushed their way into the rising crowd of gathered Coss. The flutter of motion mesmerized the pair, yet Scrooge only focused upon the wounded one. With deliberate care, the disabled Coss neared the intertwined mass of feathers and eyes. Each push upward by the crippled one was countered by a more powerful group thrust downward. The clumped mesh of spirits moved as with one breath. Twirling beneath the multitudes, the newly transformed Coss persisted.
"That Coss is going to drop from exhaustion,"
Scrooge worried. "Just watch," instructed Marley. The two followed the dance of the awkward one trying to fit in. However, only Marley was prepared for what came next. For, as Scrooge had predicted, the Coss did without warning start to fall back toward the lake of flames.
"No," screamed Scrooge. "We have to."
But before the next word cried out, 2 Coss detached from the collective, then plummeted to the level of their descending companion. As they slowed their fall to a near stop, the 2 locked feathers with the anguished creature. Together, the 3 climbed back into the accumulated heap of Coss at the crater's apex. The flow of new Coss into the horde captivated Scrooge as the churning of blacks, greys, and whites transformed the mass into a swirling storm. All the while, Barbel rained down upon the struggling spirits climbing the walls. "I assume that 2 of the arms that trapped you in the dam came from that crippled Coss," Marley said, trying to hide his grin.
"That thought crossed my mind as well," Scrooge smiled back.
Together, they observed Barbel splashing over the climbing spirits. Scrooge wondered why some spirits seemed to be repulsed by the fluid, while others purposely rubbed it all over themselves. For those spirits, it appeared to be a tonic in which the ointment energized the climber.
"Why are there such opposite reactions to Barbel?"
"It's the smell and purpose of the fluid."
"Purpose? It looks like it just helps the Coss to stay in flight,"
said Scrooge. "It keeps the crater self-sufficient."
"I thought it was the lodestones and quartz that do that."
"No, those power the crater, which in turn is electrified when the climbing spirits create the sparks that maintain their confined area." Marley pointed to those clambering up the sides of the enclosure, then said, "Those poor spirits have lost their love connection. Climbing while thinking about their crimes, they then accept responsibility for their actions, not in their head, which is easy, but in their heart. That is their only path toward acceptance. They are not given the privilege of working a task of outreach, so past actions can be repaired. All transformation happens in that hole," he said, again swinging his arm over the crater.
"Yes, but that Barbel is still a mystery,"
Scrooge said, pointing to the downpour before him.
"Why do some spirits like Barbel, while others are repulsed by it?"
"I already told you. It is the smell, Ebenezer."
"It smells like roses. Why would any ever dislike that?"
"In truth, a newly formed Coss produces Barbel that is closer to the smell of actual vomit than roses, Ebenezer." Scrooge just scratched his head as Marley continued. "Can you see the Coss at the top of the apex?" Scrooge strained to focus on the swirling assemblage of spirits.
"At the very top."
"Yes, tell me what you see," instructed Marley. Straining for visual clarification, Scrooge finally stated with confidence,
"There is only a white light up there."
"Look closer. Do you see any feathers?" Scrooge studied the iridescent flow.
"Feathers? No feathers. Yet that white light appears to be comprised of every color."
"And still, it remains white," said Marley. Scrooge asked his friend, "What color should it be?" "All colors, when combined, create a murky gray, not white, Ebenezer."
"I'm not following your point. Should I be seeing gray?"
Slowly, Marley explained, "The magic of that iridescence is not in its color, but in its light. However, it is Barbel that keeps the crater sane."
"You mean the stuff that smells like roses?"
Marley pointed to the churning glob of radiant glow, then explained, "Barbel is a dynamic substance." Scrooge just watched as Marley waved his arm back and forth to emphasize his words. "The black-feathered Coss eject an oily, horrible liquid, but as they rise and start to compress into the group, their colour, feathers, and barbell change into Coss acceptance. In the end, those at the top end up regurgitating themselves. Scrooge's eyes widened as he shook his head in bewilderment.
They retch themselves? He asked,
staring at the constant rain of barbell. Well, it ends up being more like a steady drip of their essence. Marley pointed to the apex and continued, Those Coss have already transformed into acceptance. Soon they will dissolve the crater's ceiling, and then the lot of them will fly to the abyss of final transmography, where Coss acceptance is collected.
Even the black-feathered ones?
When the top is breached, all are converted.
That is when the heads attack? Asked Scrooge.
Yes, that is the unfortunate mechanics of having to survive and change without help. Although no harm was purposely designed into the crater, Ebenezer, this is the only Mog where not all spirits will become acceptance. Some will be lost. Marley paused to watch Scrooge's reaction, then pointed deeper into the crater as he shouted, Look, Ebenezer, is that not Queen Catherine de' Medici? Toiling below them was a rather homely woman, dressed in full-length gown which covered all but her hands and face. With each thrust upwards, the spark she created lit her dress on fire, only to be doused by the fresh flow of barbell being released by the black-feathered Coss.
I would not know her. The French are of little interest for me, Jacob.
Me either, but I know that is her, Marley exclaimed, then asked, Did you ever meet Matthew Pippin, the owner of the stables I worked for as a child?
I never had the honour.
Every August 23rd, he dug out this filthy image of her, put it on the wall, and all day long would fling horse manure at her picture.
I guess the French did hold an interest for Matthew.
He's French, said Marley.
Kind of extreme for him to be so against the French Queen, then.
No, that is not it. He was always reliving the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre where she, he said, pointing to the struggling woman beneath them, murdered his family during the Protestant Huguenot purge. Only the families that fled to England and America survived. If Matthew has a say, it will take her a long while to free herself from the crater, if she ever does.
Speaking of Matthews, is not that Matthew Hopkins, the witch-finder general?
Asked Scrooge, pointing to another labouring within the crater. So it is, England's own woman-torturer.
That was a period of time where lies controlled the world's actions, said Scrooge.
I hope Apurto someday swallows his head.
Do those kind of statements bring harm to you, Jacob? Asked Scrooge.
You mean wishing another ill will?
Will you be punished for that thought?
Punishment. That is such a human reaction to disapproval, Ebenezer. Marley quieted himself, then said, Have you seen enough? Can we make our way to the chute now?
I am not sure I am ready for that, but let us travel the road.
With that said, the two once again moved toward more danger.